Walt, Waymo just repriced the Robotaxi market with an incredible raise, and they're stacking rides like I used to drop people in Mortal Kombat on video games. Waymo's going big. Uber, on the other hand, they put out a mistruth in their earnings supplement. It sounds like somebody at Uber must have been doom scrolling one of our X feeds. Very interesting context there. Then we find out for the Nashville Police Department in an X post that Waymo's coming online this month, and the foreign autonomy desk is heating up as Baidu goes driver out over in Dubai. But let's first start with Waymo and their big raise. What do you make of the raise?
16 billion at 126 billion valuation with external capital coming in, 3 billion of which is that, the rest being Google, which can obviously afford it given their size. So I think there's some validation by bringing external investors in there for sure. And look, I don't know why this should be a surprise to people. We'll get to later. There's other capital raises that are occurring in the autonomy space, but it was. And I think when that Alphabet investment printed, you saw some negative reactions in terms of on Uber and Lyft. But it's coming. This is autonomy is coming, and Waymo's got a fresh set of capital, 16 billion to go after it. Obviously, this number is small in comparison to the capex numbers that we were kind of seeing this week in terms of AI investment. But 16 billion is a nice number to get to help Alphabet on its global expansion Waymo on its global expansion.
It's the real deal. The valuation increased 144% in 16 months, up from the previous 44 billion. So Waymo's clearly onto something. You and I use the service and it works, but you're right. The capital is flowing back into autonomy. And this time the difference is the businesses are making money. There's a big difference there now. Not profitable, but they're generating cash.
There's also some, news out of the FT just talking about, again, not a surprising number, but 350 million in annual recurring revenue from this business. So, in some respects, we talk about, keep saying Alphabet, but Waymo not being at scale because, they're still upfitting cars, and 5,000 cars is small in the grand scheme of things. But obviously it's scale, right? 350 million in recurring revenue is a nice business. There was also some news that Waymo talked about in terms of unveiling an AI simulator for edge cases. They were talking about things like tornadoes and T-Rexes. So, we've had a lot of debate on using simulation data, the poster child for that clearly being Wabi, the event that we always love to talk about, CES, not this year, but 2 years ago, between Sterling Anderson and Raquel from Wabi, simulation and LiDAR, or simulation and no LiDAR versus the need for LiDAR. So look, Waymo, just because they're using a simulator doesn't mean that the years of the development that they've had don't have some value, but clearly using simulation, using generalization, which is, AI, integrating this kind of end-to-end concept can certainly enable them to continue to enter new markets at a rapid clip. Again, not to, repeat myself over and over each week, but the issue ultimately becomes a supply and getting enough cars, which has nothing to do with whether you're simulating or end to end or generalization. It's literally just physically sourcing the cars to deliver to the market.
If you look at it, Waymo's had a simulator forever. That's been well known and well documented in a lot of their research blogs. To me, the more interesting point is the vertical integration with Alphabet. If you look at how they're leveraging Google DeepMind, which will probably go down the greatest acquisition of Alphabet's history. I thought for a long time it was YouTube, but now it's clearly pointing to DeepMind. The vertical integration of the DeepMind technology into the Waymo stack. That's, to me, is the more interesting part of that. The question is, we know it's going into the car for the voice assistant. We now know it's going for simulation. The question is, where's DeepMind going next inside of the Waymo stack? That's the interesting question.
And why do you made a very good point, which is they have been using simulation for a while. So what was new about what they announced this week? They talk about edge cases. Isn't all simulation basically for edge cases? So what do you think the point of this week's announcement was?
If I put my scientific hat on, I could sit here and tell you not all simulation is created equal. But if I put my realist hat on, it tells me that the Genie 3 model had a major technical breakthrough that Waymo was not able to achieve before. In the scientific blog post they put out, they said, okay, you have Walt dash cam video. You take it, they can put that exact video into the Genie 3 simulator and simulate it as it was the Waymo driver. So to me, it says there has to be some major technical breakthrough. And as we saw today with the release of Claude Opus 4.6, these models are adapting and scaling and changing rapidly. So Waymo probably saw something in that code base that got them very, very excited.
Maybe that's it. To, non-technical people like me, it just seems like, okay, you just announced the simulator again. Also, coincidentally, it came the same week as Uber announces this AV Labs, which is also talking about collecting data that I guess they want to use with their buddies at NVIDIA, or maybe, as we talked about last week, maybe a preemption or a precedent to a potential future acquisition. So, I mean, is it possible this is just almost like responsive to Uber's AV Labs announcement?
You could view it as a game of gamesmanship, but the big common difference was in the Waymo release, the word NVIDIA wasn't uttered once. In the Uber release, it was. If you look at the Uber release, the way that it was worded, it says to me they're laying the grounds to acquire Wabi and integrate Wabi World. And no pun intended, if you want to read the tea leaves, Waymo called theirs Waymo World. So WW on both sides. I don't know.
That's pretty funny. Well, whether intentional or not, I mean, these companies are kind of dancing around each other in general. At the end of the day, you look at a Waymo valuation of 126 billion. Obviously, Uber's a big company, bigger as well. Uber reported earnings this week. Stock was effectively hurt on some of the numbers and outlook, but look, at the end of the day, all the questions on the Uber earnings call were about autonomy. Our buddy Balaji was promoted to CFO of the company. He obviously is deep in on the autonomy stuff. Probably was intently involved in putting together the presentation for the earnings call. 40% of the prepared remarks, this is the printed thing that they put out when they report, were on autonomy, and they did this whole section on myths and reality. Honestly, like when I looked through these myths and reality, it seemed like a lot of the stuff that you and I have bantered with people on Twitter.
It seems to me that they're on defense. I don't know any other way to read it, but when I read the supplement, it seemed that Uber is on defense. And I know I go harp on Reddit a lot, but if you go through the Reddit forums and you read the fact that consumers, this is a small segment, but consumers do not like the idea of hybrid. They want a fixed tier. And I think at some point, if Uber really wants to compete in autonomy, they're going to have to put an autonomous vehicle tier, because the consumers are just going to go to other options they can guarantee to get the ride they want.
So let's go through each of their myths and realities and just a quick response on them. The first myth that they talk about is AV growth is zero sum. And the reality is that the AV supply will expand the whole ride hailing category. And this is basically the Jason Calacanis narrative that we've engaged with him on Twitter. This is what I'm saying before. Like, a lot of this stuff was almost basically taken from our Twitter feed. And Jason's view, and I'm not saying Uber put this in there, but it's the same concept, is that the market expands to 30 times where it is today. Meaning that if you look at the total miles driven that are out there, that rideshare is only 1%. So when autonomy comes in and lowers prices and increases safety, that it expands the overall market. So even if Uber loses share, if Waymo goes alone, and by the way, we'll get to why they don't think that's going to happen anyway, or Tesla takes share, that if you're, 30xing the market, that even at a lower share, you're still growing to a much greater extent than you are now. And you're obviously benefiting from the autonomous partners out there that provide you that better margin opportunity and those lower costs that Dara has said repeatedly are a great way to expand the market.
I don't buy it, because there is the issue that was talked a lot about on the earnings call, the rising cost of insurance. Even if they have an autonomy division or autonomy partners, that insurance cost is still going to be a burden on your traditional business. So that problem has to be solved there. And then consumer choice. Once the consumer gets used to a consistent product, they're going to switch to that product, and they're not going to go back. The other thing to watch, and this is going into the future, watch when we start having subscriptions around personally owned AVs or hybrid subscriptions, where if you you buy a Tesla-like vehicle, but then you can also use a Robotaxi as part of your lease payment. That's going to eat into it. I know that's down the line, but I don't buy that narrative.
I'm not going to address the third one because that's just a random business case. I'm not going to disagree with you. It's not relevant to the near term. But I will talk about the first two things. The first one being the insurance. Like, I just disagree. I mean, we've already seen that you have fleets that have employees as drivers that have a fraction of the insurance that Uber pays today. And now you're going to have even safer cars with autonomy. So versus, when you compare the insurance that Uber is paying today versus what they would have to pay with fleet ownership with more safe autonomy cars, that insurance cost is going to drop, I think, significantly.
The fleet ownership, you are correct. However, there was a court case that Uber had to pay a pretty significant settlement today that could disrupt this entire situation where Uber had to pay a penalty and plead to something where the driver didn't even have to show up to court. And this is all in the court records. So I'm not going to get into what the court case was, but it's a significant court case that could have a negative long-term headwind impact on insurance for the ride-hail market in general.
Okay. Lemon literally, or whatever the company is already offering half the rates for FSD miles. So I think we can just agree to disagree on this. I think it's silly to think that autonomy is not going to substantially reduce insurance rates. What was your second thing on why the market won't expand?
But the issue that, yes, you're right with autonomy, but you have to remember Uber still has human drivers as part of their platform and the hybrid network that they're very public about. That is the hybrid part of the network is going to be a drag.
They're not paying the human rates for the autonomous cars that are going to be on their network, and they will have autonomous cars on their network.
What happened in this court case is going to send the insurance costs skyrocketing, and that is going to have a negative impact.
Maybe for the human side of their business, but again, if the market's expanding and they are going to have, I think your second thing was like, once the consumer gets used to autonomy, that's what they're going to pick. Okay, they can just pick it on the Uber network. Just everyone's not going to necessarily gravitate to one network. We'll have to see what solutions end up surviving.
You're right, but however, Uber does not, outside of the UAE, does not have a dedicated autonomous vehicle tab in the app.
You're talking about today, right? I mean, these are myths and realities about where the market's going to go. So, I mean, these are long-term, things that are impacting Uber in terms of it being a zero. So you're basically going to be on the side of this is a zero-sum game, that the ride-hailing category will not expand. And that's that. I mean, I think if you're really going to push back on that, the more legitimate pushback is that private ownership of autonomous cars is going to limit how often people will use ride-hailing. That is, I think, potentially the pushback. I think the two things that you identified, I'll just take the other side of that argument. We'll see how it plays out.
No, personal ownership is going to increase, but they're going to be within their own network. If the primary network today for TNC, let's just call a spade, is Uber. Okay, that network is going to get disaggregated into smaller personal networks, and that's what's going to have the negative effect.
I don't even understand what you mean by that.
Is that Waymo's going to have their own network, Tesla's going to have their own network, you're going to have a car brand at some point that's going to have their own network, and they're all going to have their own network, and they're not going to run through the Uber app.
Okay, but the Uber app, so there'll be competing networks, right? So the whole point of this is that Uber's share will go down, but if the market's increasing by 30x, a lower share of a much larger pie still gives you greater bookings and revenue growth than people expect you to have today. That's the point.
There's no guarantee once the consumer shifts.
Of course, there's no guarantee, but that's their view on where the market's going to be. And look, Uber's not the one saying it's 30 times. That's Jason Kokanis, but that is their view of how the market will evolve. Obviously, you disagree with that the market is not going to expand. I think it will. Whether it's enough to offset the share gains that they potentially face, we'll have to see. Obviously, Uber's going to talk their book and say that, that the market expansion is going to more than offset than any of those share losses that they're going to have.
Let's put it this way. There's going to be a lot of change coming. And it's going to be something that we're going to have to watch.
Yep. Let's go to the next myth and reality. The myth, San Francisco is the blueprint, meaning that like whatever we see in San Francisco and how Waymo's performing there that's going to be the case everywhere else. Reality, this is again according to Uber, San Francisco is a unique and easy autonomous market, not a scalable template. And I want to go into a couple more details of their point. It's high density. They're tech forward riders. Like, hey, the San Fran people are smarter, I think is what they say, basically we're saying there. Short trips. That's because you haven't had, they haven't had the airports. That's coming. Mild weather. Fine. Permissive regulation in California, I guess. Anyway, saying that this is an ideal showcase city. Most U.S. cities have longer trips, lower density, tougher regulations, blah, blah, blah. They cited L.A. and how they have not had, they've seen the same type of adoption in L.A. My guess there is L.A. is more of kind of a highway market. And as I think we already identified in L.A., having not been able to get on the highways makes those trips a lot longer, but whatever. Anyway, so for me, there's a little telco corner in here as well, where sometimes companies are like, well, wireless penetration in the United States, penetration meaning the number of people in the United States that have cell phones. Yeah, of course it's going to, when you hit 30% penetration, it's going to go to 80, but that's not going to be the case in Central America or Latin America. The economics are very different there. And what we saw was actually that it did, there was massive adoption, in a variety of different markets. And frankly, when you look at the consumer adoption curve, which you can do based on households or consumers, there's a point of inflection. We're not anywhere near that point of inflection right now. But my pushback on like San Francisco being special in that regard, and that autonomy is not going to be embraced aggressively, I'll take the other side of it. In that case is Uber's stated reality.
San Francisco is one of the hardest political places to operate a business, let alone a rideshare AV business. That's been documented through municipal hearings, through California public utilities, through permitting process. We can go down the front there, but do they have an early adopter crowd? Yes, they do. But you're right about Los Angeles because it is a compartmentalized city, but then it is also a freeway city. And the other thing with Los Angeles, I know we talked about some past podcasts, you can't go above Sunset Boulevard, and they haven't connected to the valley. You can go through the canyons, you go over the 405 or the 101. So going back to your freeways things, I don't know. It just feels that it's a lot of ingredients put into a pie where you could take some ingredients out and get a true conceptual reality. But with all the ingredients in the pie, I don't think that pie tastes very good.
Ultimately, this myth reality, I think we can potentially dunk on within 12 months, right? You'll see a market, we'll get some, zip it, rip it, whatever that data is, or in terms of adoption, going up. And we'll be like, wait a minute, I thought San Francisco was the only place where adoption would be this strong. I also think like to claim that autonomy is, and by the way, you have said this yourself on this very podcast, a tourist attraction, and that's what's driving the demand. I don't know. I just fundamentally disagree with that concept of like, autonomy. You're going to want to take autonomy because it's safer. And at some point, it'll probably be cheaper because of the things that we've already talked about. It's more reliable, and we'll see. And ultimately, I guess I'm learning that maybe not as many people are as bullish about the future of autonomy taking over everything than I am.
It is a tourist attraction, and it's good for the local economy. Waymo even put out an economy paper on this. So I stand by the tourism thing. But what I go back to is that it is a consistent experience. I took multiple people over the last week in Waymo in Miami. So Waymo, thank you for the early rider access. And the consistency. Wow, this was clean. Wow, this was smooth. Wow, I didn't have to talk to anybody. Oh, I'm never going back to Uber. I can't tell you how many people I put in the vehicle said the exact same thing because there's a consistency of the experience. They knew exactly what they were getting. The first 30 seconds, minute and a half, oh, wow, the car, look, there's no driver. Oh, that's cool. And then it's like, oh, my Spotify syncs to this. I can blast and sing my Heart's Delight out. It was just a great experience. Like, okay, I'm hooked.
All right, let's go to the next myth that the Uber claims is out there, is that autonomous fleets can maximize utilization by themselves, right? And their reality is they need a hybrid network to outperform these AV fleets only on utilization and ETAs. This is another Calcanis point. And so again, I think maybe, and this is a point that I think we went back and forth with Calcanis on. So maybe Balaji is following our Twitter pattern on this. And by the way, that may be true long-term, meaning that like I own this fleet if I'm Waymo or I've sold it at that point to someone else. maybe it's not even Waymo making the decision. Like the private equity guy now owns the fleet and says, fine, I'm going to plug it onto Uber because I want max utilization. I think that's a very good point that's made, and that could be the long term. But in the near term, that's not really required. In the near term, it's Waymo owning the fleets. It's Waymo deciding different, business models. And as they scale that, I think there's plenty of demand for the supply that they have. And the reality is that once they hit production, whether it's with Hyundai or whoever else, they can afford to have some cars sit idle, that are waiting there for those peak times. And again, this just ignores this concept that Waymo won't cut a deal with someone where you'll have privately owned Waymos that can be plugged into the network, for some of those peak times. And for those out there that say, oh, no one is going to allow their car to be plugged into a public network, there are Uber drivers every day. There are Airbnb owners every day that allow other humans in those assets. And as we've stated before, like these assets are going to go through, assets meaning the autonomous cars, are going to go back to the depots and to be cleaned before they're returned to their owner.
Here's the thing. So I had an experience, give you an example, real world experience. When I was in Miami, I wanted to go to, there's really good Chinese in West Miami, and it was outside the Waymo ODD. So I took the Waymo to my Tesla. My Tesla fully autonomously drove me to the Chinese restaurant. It was fantastic. But do I want to have to get into a shared human ride? No. And I was sitting there and I was going through Gemini. How do I stay in the ODD? How do I stay in the ODD? Because when you get used to that consistent experience, you don't want to go from a really comfortable, if you want to use the term luxury, because it is comfortable, ride in an I-Pace. Or, by the way, we had photos this week on X of Waymo testing the Hyundais in San Francisco. That consistent Ioniq 5 experience into an Uber where you don't know what you're going to get. You don't know the mood of the driver. It's the human element in this that I think is going to be an issue. Will hybrid work in some markets? 100%. Will it work for some individuals? 100%. Will it work for the me's of the world? Hell no.
I mean, I think the point is like, what is that, Krispy Kreme or Shake Shack? At some point they had their own stores, and then like when they kind of max that out, all of a sudden you see like Krispy Kreme at a gas station, right? That you use other distribution. It's just a question of when. Anyway, let's now go to the next myth and reality. Myth: autonomous vehicles will soon do every trip. Meaning, like, I think Uber's point here is like, you have ODDs, which we've used, a term we use, the geographic fence. And their point is that between edge cases or coverage gaps, you need humans for reliability. And for me, this is just like a completely made up myth. I'm not sure that like this is like any concern that people have. I think people realize that, yeah, there will be that it's going to take a while for autonomy to cover all areas. And it's frankly silly to imply that, in my view, that a consumer can't be what I would call multimodal. I mean, I have an app on my phone that I use to get on the Metro North train. I can tap to get in the subway. I have 2 different taps for rideshare. And this is, by the way, before Apple or Android have given me agentic that can help me through this. I mean, getting back to Telco Corner, my other, point here is like the mobile phone business. Like, when mobile phones first came out, I had a mobile phone and I had a landline, right? My mobile phone didn't work everywhere, so maybe I had to pick up, a cordless phone. I don't use my landline in my house at all anymore. I have it for my security. Yes, I do have security for anyone that gets too triggered by any of my LiDAR comments. But beyond that, I don't use my landline. So, I mean, and by the way, and then the last point on this is like, yes, they don't do every trip, but every year, every week, that ODD gets bigger and bigger. So those gaps that you think are going to be your savior get closed. And it's going to take time. But again, in the interim, I think the human who's going to prefer, in my opinion, autonomy because it's safer, probably cheaper, and certainly more consistent, they'll use that first. And then in these other cases, it's fine to have this other app that's there, because I'm sure Uber will still exist.
100% it will exist. That I don't care about. I care more about your house and your security. Do you put LiDAR on the perimeter to make sure nobody comes by and you can spot them?
Grayson, the point is that I no longer use my landline. Let's just leave it there.
Walt has entered the future. We got Walt the future. But your point about expanding ODDs is correct. Remember, San Francisco started small. Then it started gradually going down. Then it made it all the way to Mountain View, then to Palo Alto. And then before you know it, to San Jose. And it's the Super Bowl this weekend. I'm very sorry, Walt. I know I won't rub it in, but I'm sorry. You could take the Waymo to the Super Bowl now. Now, see? And it's going to keep expanding. So are AVs going to do every trip soon? No, but will they do more and more of the trips as the ODDs get bigger and bigger? Yes.
Which is a good segue into our last one, which is their myth is scaling a few big cities captures most profits. And the reality is, which they gave data behind all of these things, they gave data, that the US profit are a long tail. Obviously, they're a huge international market, but autonomy is coming internationally as well, by the way. But the point is, like in the US, like and I think this is fair, that there's perception of like you hit them hard in New York and San Fran and all of a sudden it's going to show up. That's true. Like, I think that's a fair point, but like stocks are a reflection of future profits, right? And again, getting back to Telco Corner, this is like covering wireless stocks in the early 90s. They had no EBITDA. There was no sight of free cash flow or earnings. So there was tremendous investor focus on those subscriber additions, and frankly, there still are, as an indicator of future growth. So investors will look at these individual markets, even though it may not negatively impact Uber's results in a given quarter. If there's indications that they can use to graph out future growth in the area, then that's going to be an issue, right? It's seeing how the profits get impacted on a market by market basis, and then knowing that, in fact, Waymo is not stopping at 20 markets. And in fact, this week, Waymo announced 2 markets or further development. We already kind of knew about Boston, but basically talking about Boston and Sacramento, neither of those markets are top 20. So by the way, like, even if you're saying the myth is like, oh, if they only impact us in the top 5 markets, we're fine. Like, okay, great. But Waymo's not stopping at the top 5 markets. They're not stopping at the top 20 markets. They're going to keep going. By the way, it's something I pointed out on Twitter that was liked by Takendra herself. Like, so yeah, they're continuing to expand beyond these initial markets.
Waymo has clear, grand ambitions. The financing round of the 16 billion of 13 billion coming from Alphabet is a clear indicator there. And you listen to the earnings call, it appears to me Alphabet's all in on this, and their ambitions are grand. If certain individuals think that Waymo's going to be limited to certain major markets, your examples around Sacramento especially just debunk that. Even though Sacramento's a large growing market, soon to get a baseball team, they're going to go to bigger and bigger markets. I think they're going to go to markets that you and I wouldn't suspect. Look, they're going to St. Louis. Nashville's a growing market. They're going there. And I think you're going to see them move more into the middle of the country as well. And the best part about that is, for me, from a political standpoint, it's going to help build consumer trust and adoption of this technology, because those individuals will start talking about it and getting very, very vocal.
The other thing that they talked about on this call a lot, which they left the impression that, one of their key success factors is being, this service component. But, that's not something that they actually own, right? And by the way, incrementally, like Nashville, that's Lyft's market. And there was comments that Lyft is going to, or Nashville with Waymo, will be out later this month. And, Lyft has made a big deal about how, using FlexDrive, that's going to be a key part of their success. Obviously, the other issue is that the fleet is integrated. So basically, a Waymo can plug into Lyft and plug into Waymo One, as opposed to joint markets that Uber has, where there's literally separate Waymo fleets for each of them. But the point here is that I think they were trying to leave investors with the impression that they've got this service component, but this is all like minority stakes. And that brings us, by the way, Grayson, to our newest segment, which we're going to call the pit stop. And this is where we're going to break down what we would call the gritty high stakes business of robotaxi depots. Power infrastructure required for the rapid charging, logistical gymnastics, cleaning the fleets, technical precision, 24/7 servicing. I mean, software is obviously still important, and that's going to be the sexy part of the podcast, but the pit stop is the important stuff. And as you know, we've been all over this from the earliest episodes of Autonomy Markets. So yes, just like we added the foreign autonomy desk, we are adding pit stop. So on our first, and to kick off this segment on pit stop, we're going to the Grayson, Inspector Clouseau, investigator hat. You were out looking for pit stops, or in this case, depots in the Miami area. So what did you find? Tell us what we need to know.
I will tell you that, but before we get to that, I just do want to give a plug. Tuesday on the Road to Autonomy, Jeremy Bird from Lyft came on to talk all about Flex Drive in Nashville. So if you want to get a really good insight on Flex Drive in Nashville, tune in to the Road to Autonomy on Tuesday because Jeremy Bird lays it out. And I will give you a little teaser. They're up and running and fully operating the Flex Drive operations in Nashville. So with that tease, out comes the inspector hat. That's right. And I'll have you know, I was riding around in Waymo for the last 2 days and I was wearing the inspector hat and people looked at me like I was crazy. I waved, I rolled the window down and I talked to people. So Waymo, I should become an ambassador. I got all sorts of wonderful men and women in Miami that want to ride in the Waymos. So I put the inspector hat on and I pulled out my trusty magnifying glass and I went in search of the Waymo depots, plural. That's plural, Walt. There was 2 depots according to public records, both in the Miami Business Journal, South Business Journals, and in the building permits. And we found 2 interesting depots. One depot is 1.7 miles away from the Miami airport. Interesting to note, it does not need to take highways. It is all service roads. The second depot is 4.3 miles away from the airport. The distance apart from each depot is 3.4 miles. So very interesting. Yes, you can say they are close to one another, but if you spend time in Miami, you'll know something. There's a lot of traffic. And when I say a lot of traffic, to put that into perspective, you could be looking at a 40-minute, 45-minute drive between depots at certain times of the day.
Can you give us some sense of where these depots are for the greater Miami area? Meaning that, like, if we think the point of having a good depot for storage and cleaning is to have the supply close to the demand, it seems like you should spread these things out. They seem like they're too close together. Is there an area that you think they would be better? And like, why do you think they would have put them so close together?
Well, first, let me explain where they are, and I'll just use general Miami geography. And the depot that is currently operational today is in the northeast quadrant of the ODD, which is about a mile and a half, mile and a quarter from the design district. Why is that important? The design district is one of the most highly trafficked areas of Miami, where it's the shopping center. So very strategically important there. The other depot, strategically important off a service road to the airport. So that's why I think those 2 were there. When you look at the ODD it is today, you are going to need a depot probably down in Homestead, South Coral Gables, in that area. And you eventually will need one further in West Miami. That's on the mainland. And then I do believe when Waymo expands to the beaches, you have South Beach, Mid Beach, North Beach, Surfside, because again, going back to traffic, Waymo will have to put, if you want to use the term the beaches, they're going to have to put one out there. So I'll sit here and say that Waymo is going to need 4 to 5 depots to truly scale the Miami market to 1,200 to 1,300 vehicles. And I base that off of traffic.
And how would you compare Miami to other cities? Because right now in LA, what do they have? I think 3 maybe depots. So they haven't hit those types of numbers in any of the existing markets that they're in.
It's going to be a slow roll. I just think this, based on the geographic makeups of where it is. But again, I don't have access to a demand map, so I can't tell you. I'm basing this off of traffic patterns is what I'm basing this off of. And moving these vehicles, especially at high traffic times, is going to be very, very difficult.
Why don't you tell us about the depots themselves? Like, are they 2 operational depots?
So we have 2 depots. One depot is filed for a building permit to build. There is currently no construction happening. There is no building permit on the outside. I will say it is one of the most interesting neighborhoods I've ever been to. And to make you chuckle, Walt, Tony Soprano would feel right at home in this neighborhood. And you can read between the lines on that one for what that neighborhood's like. And that neighborhood is interesting. I did not see a substation near there. And on the other interesting point of that, it backs up to a river. So that's kind of interesting. But however, across the street towards the airport.
So is the one you're describing operational or not?
That is not operational, this one, no.
So it's not even being built? So how did you even find out about this one?
There was an article in the South Florida Business Journal. And we used that and compared it with public records.
Any info on who owns this thing? Is this like a Waymo-owned depot?
According to the filings with the Miami-Dade County, the depot is owned by a investor, which I'll omit his name for privacy reasons. It is a company. And the lessee of the depot is Move, FLAV LLC, which has a public contract with Waymo. So it is a Move operated depot for Waymo.
Right, which is something I guess we knew already, that when Waymo announced this market, they did talk about his Move. Move is, has a minority ownership by Uber, but as a reminder to our listeners, this is a Waymo only market, even though they're using Move, which is a Uber partner.
Correct. So that's the, if you want to, we're going to park that now. That is the non-operational depot. Now we're going to move to the northeast quadrant by the design district on the outskirts of Wynwood. And by the way, shout out to Ali, Surf Robotics, buddy. They were all over the place there in Wynwood. So well done on that. And to Zach at Coco, I saw a bunch of your Cocos there as well. The depot on the outskirts of Wynwood, on the outskirts of the design district, is operational. And there's currently construction going on at that depot. And so I put the inspector hat on, and so I started looking around. And who do you think the construction crew is, Walt? You got to give me a guess. Who do you think it is?
No idea.
Florida Power and Light. Florida Power and Light was doing micro trenching across the street about 8 yards, 7 yards is a massive FPL, which is Florida Power and Light substation. And FPL was doing conduit work from the substation to the Waymo depot. Reading between the lines what I saw, it looks like Waymo was getting ready to scale that. Strategic location across from the substation, roughly saw 35, 40 chargers, and that turns to 80 as we saw from Austin because they have a plug in each side. Interesting fact is they have the depot covered up so you can't see in. However, there is no lightning facade, no hurricane facade, and they're operating out of pods. Remember when people had to move to go back to college? Pods are operating out of pods on an open lot.
So they have one operational that's out in the weather, and another one that it looks like they're getting ready to have indoors. So I guess the question is, would they get rid of this? Because I think in LA, I saw a terawatt depot that I think Waymo was using in LA, which also was not covered. It was an open lot that they were using.
Big difference between LA, Miami, tropical downpours, hurricanes. LA, you don't have tropical downpours, you have downpours in the winter, but you don't have hurricanes. So big difference. And then the other difference too, lightning. There's lightning in Miami, so you're going to have to provide shelter for those employees that are operating at the depot. Perhaps they put some sort of lightning cover up. I don't know. I'm just speculating here. But I could see that becoming a staging lot, not the, if you want to call it, the permanent operations lot.
Right, for servicing, but maybe something for just simply for charging. And there's different, what you've seen in other markets, there's some lots like the terawatt lot that was just basically charging, maybe basic cleaning. And then maybe Transdev had a different lot where you had people actually fixing the cars and the sensors and things like that. So, maybe they're following the same model here. And then Move, I assume Move was the owner of this lot as well?
The owner, no. The lessee, yes. But I want to also point something else out, which is very interesting, not to go back to football here, but coming in from the north into the depot, I counted 3 Waymo vehicles. These are with safety attendants, and they had their vests on, actively driving. I don't know if they were testing or they were mapping. I don't want to speculate there, but they're about 2 miles outside of the ODD, because I believe at some point that Waymo is going to expand the ODD up to Miami Gardens to connect Hard Rock. So that depot gives you a strategic angle to get to Hard Rock.
So we have another segment on the pit stop, or another portion of the segment for pit stop, which is our friends at Tesla trying to secure their depot in San Francisco in a parking lot, which they were going to, I think, keep part of it public. And surprise, surprise, Teamsters Local 665 has effectively blocked this. And, well, I guess they haven't blocked it, but they've lobbied against it. And you have, I guess, something known as the San Francisco Planning Commission, where you had 8 different people, 8 supervisors, sign on to this Teamsters appeal. Like, on the Lightshed podcast, we have Disgrace of the Week. I mean, I can't imagine what the excuse of these supervisors was, but like, how is that not a disgrace? I mean, you talk about like San Francisco or even anywhere in California being friendly from a regulatory standpoint. How would you explain this?
I would say it to you this way, Walt. Go on Open Secrets and type in their names and say follow the money and look at the political donations. There's no other way to say it. They said, oh, it's because it's going to kill jobs. You and I both know on the pit stop, what do depots do? They create jobs. I saw individuals clean the vehicles, supervising vehicles, doing all sorts of things there. Depots create jobs, not to mention the mechanics that have to install the chargers, the electricians that have to install electricity, the permitting people. There's a lot of jobs created there, and the economic impact is positive.
But it just goes back to, again, the myths and realities, where one of the things that Uber was mentioning was San Francisco being like regulatory friendly. I mean, I believe that you could put the San Fran Planning Commission as part of regulations to launch a business. Why is it okay for Waymo and Uber and everything else to be there, but Tesla not? I have a good idea what the answer is, but obviously that's part of what makes the pit stop like an important part of this segment. It's something that I think we alone have covered a lot over the past year, and I think will be a critical element of the scaling of this industry.
Big time. Because if you want to use the Hollywood term, below the line creates jobs. And you're right, you and I on our Autonomy Markets show, we're some of the only ones that cover this in depth. And if you want the answer for why this happened at Tesla, 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. That's why it happened.
So let's move to DC from California, because there was a lot of Senate testimony this week. The one we'll get to is the national framework discussion, which I think we've addressed here in recent episodes. But my partner, Rich, on the media side, did go down for an antitrust hearing on the sale of Warner Brothers to Netflix. He was upstaged, though, by Monopoly Man, the guy that wears hats like you. You're going to have to get the Hasbro Man Monopoly hat with the hat and the monocle and the white mustache. I don't know if the Monopoly Man had a beard. So he was sitting right next to the Monopoly Man. He was a little, and it must have been Rich's like first hearing, was kind of reacting to these, some of these questions, which had nothing to do with antitrust. But in any event, the next day was autonomy. I thought the questions were much better than they were for Netflix. The Waymo representative, I think could have been stronger. And I didn't remember the name of the representative that was asking him about the remote drivers. This is the thing that we've kind of complained about in terms of the lack of transparency. So it was great to see them getting asked this question. Resist, and finally basically just admitted that a portion of these remote drivers, they're not remote drivers, like they're not taking control of the Waymo, but they provide advice on what to do, and then the Waymo drives, but that they're located in the Philippines. I was surprised, I guess, that was the case. I guess I wasn't completely surprised. I had heard that about Waymo, but given where they are in their rollout and the need to get, looking for a national framework, individual local approvals, seems a little early to move those jobs overseas when you haven't really gotten through a lot of the regulatory process in this country.
I agree with that, but I want to go to telco here. What type of latency is there from let's just use Manila to San Francisco? What type of latency is there?
There is some. There's no doubt about that. You could theoretically use Starlink, which actually reduces your latency if you're going straight up and over. But I don't think these decisions that are getting made by these remote people are that instantaneous. But look, any distance will add some level of latency. Sometimes it has more to do with the number of components between point A and point B. Like if you have a direct fiber line all the way there, it's going to be faster than maybe a shorter distance going through multiple components. And there's ways around that. So to me, the concern is more political. And remember, Grayson, you don't need latency. They're not driving the car. They're just saying okay, the car doesn't want to do in this situation. Do I do A or B? And the remote attendant is going to basically select something to get them out of a jam or something that they're about to come up on that they need some additional guidance on.
Could that have since now that we know they're in the Philippines, could that have had any impact on the blackout where the vehicles got stopped if the cellular was down?
I don't know if it had an impact, but it's certainly, don't you think, embarrassing? Like you've admitted in a hearing when you're trying to get a national framework, and again, you have individual states that can now use this testimony and say like, oh, there's some person in, the Philippines and they're going to get hacked and they're going to take control of these Waymos in our country. And like that, those risk factors, I mean, it's an unforced error. Like, just like, I think, you talked earlier about the unforced error in terms of using Zeekr, which I think was asked about as well. It's just an unforced error. Like, did you really need to move those jobs to the Philippines now? I mean, you only have 5,000 cars. Just put those people in this country. Let's get through the scaling process. And then maybe year 3 or year 4 or whatever it is, if you need to optimize, sure, add some of these markets. But like, I don't know the thought process on doing that now.
It seems odd. I mean, to me, it is a critical error. Let's say we don't know how many individuals that wasn't disclosed, but let's say they were in the state of Texas. It'd be a different conversation right now. But you're right about the unforced error with the Zeekr. They got hammered on the Zeekr over the China stuff. And I'm telling you, I don't think that we've heard the last of the Zeekr. And I still think there's a very good possibility that they never deploy the Zeekr, because one of the senators said, oh, so you're using a loophole to put Chinese communist vehicles on the roads of America. This is the senator's direct words. That's not a good place to be.
I mean, there are Zeekrs on the road today. I don't know if are there any Zeekrs accepting a paying ride, I believe in LA, or are they only basically just test vehicles at this point?
As far as I know, you and me as a civilian, not as non-Waymo employees, cannot ride or hail a Zeekr, but I need confirmation on that.
Well, I'm sure we'll hear about that in our comments, but I've definitely seen a lot of stuff on Reddit and elsewhere where there are Zeekrs on the road. But you might be right that there's no paid vehicles, and maybe this will be a state by state issue. But let's get back to what the hearing was about and the legislation that's getting proposed. What are your latest thoughts on getting a national framework?
We're getting closer. I do want to say for the record that I thought the gentleman from Tesla did a fantastic job testifying with his safety background and his sharp answer. So that gentleman did a very good job, reflected very well on Tesla, and that gentleman also debunked a lot of the stuff around redundancy on the camera. So to the gentleman from Tesla, well done on that. I believe that we are inching forward towards a national framework. However, I have trepidation that trucks are potentially going to be cut out from the bill, and it's going to be a robotaxi only bill. That's kind of where it looks like it's going. Trucks did not come up in the hearing, but we're going into a midterm election, and I'll just say this for the record. I don't think anything's going to happen, but I think we're inching closer, but I don't think anything's going to happen at the end of the day.
Well, that's unfortunate, but, I thought in that case, I enjoyed the hearing, at least the parts that I could see. And I think in general, people did a good job. But, look, just underscores, I think Waymo needs to be a little bit more open with information, and some of their decisions may be better thought out. By the way, Waymo is not the only one raising money. You also had a company, Bedrock, which raised $270 million, big number for that size company, at a valuation of $1.75 billion, or so basically just under $2 billion. That's basically similar in size to where Kodiak is trading in the market today. Obviously much smaller than where Aurora is, which trades at about an $8 billion valuation. This is a company, you have basically veterans of Waymo, and Autonomy Markets. We do all types of autonomy. In this case, they're automating excavators and other building equipment, which is another important part. This reminds me, I was just watching, what is it, Landman, and I think they were at a big conference, and the guys saw some oil rig that was automated, and talking about the future of their job. So that kind of resonated with me when I saw this capital raise.
It's coming in. Bedrock has done a great job. Kevin Peterson, the co-founder and CTO, was on the Road to Autonomy podcast in late July, and I think that there's a tremendous opportunity coming in industrial. Not to plug the Road to Autonomy again, but we have a really great episode coming up with the CTO of Oshkosh, all about the opportunities of autonomy in industrial. The physical AI trend is taking hold, and the $270 million cap raise by Bedrock is a clear indicator that investors are interested in industrial autonomy. And for the audience, it's very important. Autonomy is not just robo taxis and trucks. there's a whole lot more to autonomy. And as the market expands, Walt and I are going to be there each and every week covering it for you.
Once again, Grayson, there you go again. Road to autonomy. Here's a company that just got valued at just under $2 billion. And for any listeners of Road to Autonomy and the deepest library of content in all of autonomy media content, the guy was featured on the Road to Autonomy in July of last year, and now they're raising at $2 billion now. If you haven't, don't just listen to the latest episode. Delve into the Road to Autonomy library and look for those gems of interviews that Grayson's been doing for quite some time now. There is no larger library of content in this space, bar none.
Thank you. There's a lot of really great insights and trends in the library that months, years later come to fruition, and these founders go on to build great things. Well, let's go to the foreign autonomy desk, because we're trying to incorporate more foreign autonomy content into the Road to Autonomy. And yes, there is a lot of foreign autonomy coming in the next couple of weeks. Baidu took the ruler of the UAE, drive her out in Dubai, RT6. They finally officially launched. Thoughts?
Good for Baidu. I mean, Dubai, we also have WeRide in the Middle East and talking with Uber about doing 1,200 robotaxis. So I don't know. Middle East is turning into like the easy mode beachhead for scale deployments. You got Baidu in Dubai, you got WeRide, and what they're doing. They seem very receptive to autonomy in these markets.
Speaking to a policy friend of mine, and this is something that we should do more content on, the UAE, and to some extent Saudi Arabia, are becoming the most interesting markets in autonomy for one simple reason: is the only place in the world today where East meets West, where you're going to see U.S. robotaxis deployed and Chinese robotaxis deployed in the same geographical region. That's going to be very interesting and something for us to monitor how that goes. So let's keep our eyes on that. And staying on the China front, Tesla opened up a AI training lab on the mainland, according to local media, to train vehicle data. That's going to get interesting.
I mean, how much training do they need? I thought the whole point of Robotaxi is it's AI and you can just use it.
Perhaps I've never been to China, so I don't want to speak about the roads. Perhaps there's some uniqueness in the roads that they need to train for, but it is a sign, in my opinion, that Tesla is clearly looking for an expansion in China. And I got to ask you, you do a great job covering Apple. You go on Bloomberg and CNBC to talk about Apple. Do you think, in your opinion, is Tesla going to try an Apple-like play in China?
I think Tim Cook has sealed a close relationship with China that is very unique. So I think that's challenging for other people. Tesla's done, I think, a decent job in general. Let's focus on getting scale in Austin before we worry about the broader market. You know, it's one of these things where let's knock off a couple of the key items. And again, just as an aside, we talked about this on the Light Shed podcast today. We didn't talk about it here. You know, there was news SpaceX has now purchased XAI and X. I wouldn't expect in the near term Tesla to be rolled into that. I know there's been some speculation. Tesla's got its own things that it's dealing with that are great opportunities for them. Robotaxi, obviously Optimus. That there's not a need necessarily for these companies to come together now. Maybe sometime down the road, but and similarly, SpaceX, which is kind of preparing itself for its own IPO later this year, is, you know, they'll have their own scale and they'll have Grok, and there will be some cross pollination between these companies and partnerships. But I wouldn't look for those two things to come together quite so soon.
Soon you're going to get a sci-fi movie in your car. Instead of start full self-drive, it's going to say, Grok, take me to the moon. That's where it's going. When it gets there, I don't know when. We
joke about Grok though, and like I actually purchased another car. In this case, I need a larger car, so I got a Ford Expedition Max. They integrate with Google, but it's not Gemini in this Ford. So it's like you can say, "Oh, okay, Google," and ask the question. I've gotten so used to asking Grok questions, and it works like a great AI voice agent where you can interrupt it and there's back and forth and integration with some of the functionality on there. Like stepping down to, and again, you know, Gemini is great, but stepping down to like ask Google is terrible. And then earlier today I saw headlines like Siri for CarPlay is now going to enable now some of these agents. So I don't know whether they'll enable Grok, but being able to enable, your chat GPT where you can talk back and forth, kind of a reflection of where Siri is, and kind of more importantly, in terms of this podcast, where OEMs are, with that integration that they have with the agents, and the cars. I mean, Grok has made that experience. I don't know if you use it at all when you're driving, but I use it all the time now. It's great.
It's a great integration. As we saw today with Stellantis print, the OEMs have a lot of things to figure out. As the OEMs work on figuring things out, what do you and I need to look for in the autonomy markets over the next week?
You got a lot of earnings still. Lyft is going to report. So maybe Risher will talk about Nashville launching. Seems like the right time. We got to get to Nashville, I guess. Catch some music. Check out the Flex Drive. Aurora's going to report. Rivian's going to report. Obviously, they're one we got to keep an eye on with their ambitions. Instacart, doesn't talk as much about autonomy, but certainly that's going to touch them. And, obviously, I think we have to start going back now that Google's got all this money in its back pocket. Start looking for and hoping for maybe some new OEM relationships for them to announce. They had that kind of pseudo press release last year with Toyota, which amounted to nothing. Maybe we get some follow through on that.
Well, let's wait and see, because we do know that Waymo needs vehicles as they scale. The future is bright, the future is autonomous, the future is scaling. Walt, until next week.